To kick off looking at PHP, we're going to start by looking at variables. So we can have a lot of different types of variables. We can have strings, integers, floating point numbers, arrays, objects, and booleans. And we'll look at each one of those one at a time, but every variable is assigned a handle to it, and that's fairly common in programming languages. So the way we define a variable name is by using a $, and it has to start with a $, and be followed by either an underscore or a letter. It cannot be followed by a number. So I could say peaches, that's a good variable name. I could say underscore peaches, that still works, but this does not. Cannot use a number, cannot start it with a number. So I could say peaches 2, and that works. And that should cover what you need to know as far as naming goes. So the different types we said are strings, which is just a collection of characters. So we start a quote and we say fruit. Everything inside the quotes is our string. We use the semicolon at the end to denote that we're done with that line. We also have integers. So I can just use a straight number. You'll notice if I'm using an integer, I don't need to use quotes around it. You can also have what's called a floating point number, which is basically a decimal point, or a number with a decimal point in it. For our practices, that's good enough. And we can also have an array. An array is just a list of values. So I could say oranges, apples, and peaches. And we've created an array. And we'll look at arrays in a little more depth in a few moments. We can also have what's called a boolean, and that's just, it's either a true or it's false. And we'll see uses for that as we go, but those are the only two values, and we'll notice it's not in quotes because it actually represents a value. It's either true or it's false. And so we call that a boolean. And we can also have objects, and objects we'll touch on further down the road, but you'll notice that objects always start with the new keyword. So we have new, and if we had a class defined as car, then we would have created a new object based on the car class. And again, we'll go over that in more detail in future sessions. So let's go back to our array. This one has got a lot of possibilities, and we'll be using arrays constantly. So let's look at some of the different ways we can define them and things we can do with them. So we've got our array up here. I'm going to get rid of the rest of these for make it a little bit easier. Now we've got 3 items in this array, and we can reference them by using the brackets and a number. So when we say peaches 2, we're not referring to apples because arrays start counting from 0. So this is item 0, this is item 1, and this is item 2. What we're using right here is a shorthand. What is really going on is the computer sees it, is that we have oranges, and this is the longhand, if you will, and it lets you see a little bit more of what's actually going on. So this is actually specifying the keys. Arrays are made up of key value pairs, and so we say, okay, for this key there is this value. For this key of 1 there is this value. Now up here we're using shorthand because we're just assuming that the keys are going to automatically be assigned, and they are, as starting from 0, 1, and then 2. So when I'm referring to peaches 2, I'm referring to the peaches string. One thing you can also do is you can define non-integer keys. So I could come in and say peaches equals array, and we'll say that this is fruit equals peaches. and potato. And so we're defining custom keys for each one of these. And so if we refer to peaches bracket fruit, close the bracket, now we're referring to peaches. We've accessed that value. You can also add new items to an array, and one way you can do that is just by creating it. So I can say peaches dessert equals ice cream, and I've added a new item to that peaches array. If I was to come in and say peaches vegetable, since that already exists, if I define a new value, then I've overwritten that. So now my array would look something like this with the changes that I've made. Say And that's what we've created as we've gone through changing these different variables. Also keep in mind that you can define what's called a multidimensional array. So at this point I've been assigning to each key, I've been assigning a string as a value. I could be coming in and assigning anything as a value. I could be assigning an integer, or I could be defining a floating point or another array. So I could come in and say array, and inside that I could be adding additional values. Again, comma separated or however we need to. And if I want to access one of those, then I could come in and say peaches dessert 0. Let's make these different so it makes a little more sense. So at this point I'm accessing the test string, because I'm saying, okay, in the first level of the array I'm looking for the dessert key, and then inside that array, or the array that's nested inside of it, I want the first key, or the key with 0. As we said, shorthand says this is 0, this has a key of 1, and this has a key of 2. So if I'm looking for 0, that's my key. Now we said that strings are surrounded by quotes. I want to touch on that. So let's just create another variable, and I'm going to say this is called dessert, and I've got a string. Now you can also use double quotes, and that works. The difference between both of them will work just equally, so I'm going to put them both in here so we can do a comparison. Now with double quotes you can put other variables inside. So I could say vegetable. So in that case, if I had a variable defined as vegetable, then this would actually have a value of dessert good. If you do single quotes, it doesn't allow you to do that. There is a small performance advantage in using single quotes, since each string does not have to be parsed by the PHP parser to look and see if there is any variables. So it's just slightly faster to use it that way. It's also easier as a best practice to use it, because if you're using HTML, which in its attributes have, the convention is to use double quotes, you end up not having to escape anything out. So I could come in and say google.com. You'll notice I'm using double quotes here. It's not causing me any problems. However, if I was to come in here, let's just go ahead and copy this. Then you'll see that actually my line ends once it hits that one, so I've got a problem. And then also I'll have a problem further on down. So we can solve that by escaping a character using the backslash. In this case, we'll need to escape both of those. So now we have a string, and that works, but it's definitely a little bit cleaner not to have to escape if that's the convention that you're used to. So as a best practice, I recommend using single quotes whenever possible, and to use double quotes in your HTML. One additional thing you can do is you can assign dynamic variables. So we've got our vegetable with the value of good up here. So we could come in and we can use the curly braces and put another variable in here. And so what this is doing is creating a variable called good, except it's doing it dynamically. So it's going to take this value, use it in here, and so then if we assigned, let's make something up here, then we've done the same thing as saying good equals dessert. Now this can be really useful, and we'll look as time goes on, we'll look at different ways that this can be used. The only downside to it is that then it becomes much more difficult to track down in your code different variables and things like that. So it should be used judiciously and make sure that it's not going to cause any problems for readability when you come back to your code in 3 to 4 years.